ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, and especially this week in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. It is the dog days of summer in America, and things continue to get hot around the world, and the national security environment is no exception. While a lot of people are at the beach, war is being waged around the world and with our forces and in our name. So I wanted to reconnect with a returning champion, a guy who's an expert in all things defense, military, combat, and a really insightful and cool guy. The Washington Post's fearless reporter, the great and powerful Dan Lamothe, is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, Dan. How are you, buddy?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the hard stuff, how about them Yanks? And
I'm watching New York and Boston circle the drain on different timetables, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're a Red Sox fan. I'm a Yankees fan. Yanks have had a hard run here, but I'm still. I'd rather have my hand of cards than yours as a Red Sox fan right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were exactly what we feared they would be this year in Massachusetts. So,
Well, it's still it's a fun time to be a baseball fan. I think the Mets fans have an edge on all of us right now based off recent run, but not the recent series. But I ask everybody this: you've been around the world lately. Where are you, and how are you?
I'm home. I'm in Northern Virginia. I've been working on a couple long-term projects that are finally dropping. And then in addition to that, it's, I mean, for me, it's big tournament season. So we actually tend to take our vacations in this family in the fall, once everybody else goes back to school and things are a little more quiet. So yeah, I'm kind of wrapping things up and probably moving in that direction in September, October.
Excellent. Okay, so one main reason I want to bring it back, it is the 1 year anniversary of the American pullout of Afghanistan. It's also the 6 month anniversary of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I want to talk about Afghanistan. I want to talk about the Syrians, the strike in Syria that Biden ordered really recently, what's happening in Ukraine, kind of all of it. But I want to start with your new reporting. You continue to be, I think, one of the best reporters on all things Afghanistan and the intersection of the American military. And you've got a powerful new piece up with a companion audio and podcast piece that's also very powerful. We'll listen to it, let's link to it in the show notes. But 1 year after pullout of Afghanistan, which many, including myself, have viewed as a debacle, there's a lot of trauma in the veterans community. We now see Matt Zeller, our friend of the show, and the Association of Afghan Allies and the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans America are kind of sounding alarm and again on how many of our allies are just off the grid and missing, but also underscoring the moral injury that many of us as veterans are facing a year later after seeing so many of our friends die. But let's start with your reporting, your new reporting, Dan. What do you think is the most important takeaway here, and what have you learned?
Thanks. So we've been chipping away at this for months, and really, I mean, one of the difficulties here was finding both service members who were willing to talk and then also allowed to talk. So we got different flavors of answers when requesting these interviews. In some cases, even when service members were willing to do it, they had to get permission, and that's not always easy. But we were able to get 14 service members on the record, kind of describing the evacuation beginning to end. Several new things surfaced. I thought one thing that was notable is the level of chaos at the front end of this, right on the 15th. I have members of the 10th Mountain Division who were there at the airport, describing a firefight like at the traffic circle at the airport on day one, and sort of underscoring how unpredictable the whole thing was right from Jump Street. They tried to hold back the crowds. They were actually at times linked arm in arm, trying to hold back these crowds. And when you saw the surge of civilians onto the runway, that was despite the best efforts of the soldiers and some of the Marines who were there. There just simply weren't enough troops at that time to get that job done, which is why we saw the next day or two this effort to kind of take back the airport, to prevent things like civilians falling off of aircraft, all of those things. Yeah, I think we were able to get a much better sense of how this looked through the average sergeant on the ground, and how dramatic and shocking and frustrating this was through their eyes.
Can I pause you on one vignette that I read that was powerful? One guy kind of said he described it like a scene from 300, where they were like lined
Yeah.
up shield to shield trying to stop a human wave. And I think we saw bits of that on television, but I think also hearing the recounts of how traumatic this was for these folks who were there and how they're still carrying around that guilt and that pain, I think is something that's going to surprise most Americans.
I think one of the most important reasons for me to do this piece was to kind of underscore and expand on public knowledge of just the weight we're asking the people that were there to carry around. You know, I mean, I'm used to doing interviews that kind of revolve around trauma, but it was striking doing these interviews, numerous occasions, numerous people where they had to stop to compose themselves. You know, in some cases where they're basically, you know, you see the tears coming mid-interview, and you give them a chance to gather. And you know, I thought that was important, and I actually thought that was one of the reasons it was powerful to, with permission, have an audio portion to this. You know, it gives them the opportunity to share for listeners and viewers to hear their voice, but at the same time, it doesn't have a television camera shoved in their face. So hopefully, a little more comfortable for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff I don't know how the process works. Somebody's going to submit it for a Pulitzer because I think it's really going to unearth the human side of this that I think has politically been kind of glossed over. It doesn't feel like the White House wants to look back. But I think what's clear from what I've read so far is just this weight that they're carrying and the guilt that they're carrying and just the heaviness of it. You talked to one soldier that lost his leg. Can you talk about that person in that story in particular?
Yeah, he's a Marine sergeant, lost one arm and one leg and pieces of several organs. 43 surgeries later, he sat down and talked with us. And he's basically the last long-term patient at Walter Reed Hospital, and quite likely the last amputee from this war. Tyler Vargas Andrews, he was remarkable. We there was no rush. We scheduled it on the books for 3 hours, which is already a pretty, dramatic, commitment on his part to telling his own story. And we actually overran that. We were probably there close to 4 hours. And he kind of from beginning to end walked us through his experience there, his frustration watching the Taliban beat on people, as a member of a scout sniper team, he was up in the guard tower overlooking the outside of Abbey Gate, overlooking kind of that open corridor we all saw in the news and on video last year. So he was able to see a lot of things that other service members were not. And he's carrying a lot of that now, and they're very angry in some ways about what he saw, and just the reality of the situation. He understands, they had the ability to, open fire and stop some of this, but the cascade of consequences to that, would have created all kinds of problems. You take out one Taliban fighter who's beating or executing someone. What's the second and third order effects of this when everything's kind of teetering on the edge, and you've already got so much chaos going on.
You report on one vignette where he or another troop is up in the guard tower and saying, we see someone who looks like someone who fits the description of the suicide bomber. We request permission to fire. That permission's denied, right? But that giving a sense of how tenuous and tense that is, and also the magnitude of the decision-making process they had to go to. You also mentioned Taliban executions. Can you talk about that? Because that's not something I think has been reported before, or at least that I've seen.
Yeah, so I had versions of this and some stories last fall, but at the time it was more, hey, we heard gunshots, and these were, people that were inside the airport. You're hearing gunfire. Sometimes you're hearing single shots, and those individuals didn't have eyes on it, but they assumed they were hearing executions. Tyler's saying he saw the body straight up, and he's carrying that. And then in terms of that suicide bomber you mentioned, yeah, that was a pretty striking, detail from him. Basically, we're all aware that there was a threat of suicide bombings, and that they were worried about it for a couple of days there, in particular toward the end. He's saying he saw someone that matches the description, that he and another Marine in the tower asked for permission to engage. The permission was denied. I think there's a number of reasons why that might be a logical thing to deny, given the uncertainty of what they were seeing, and also all of the second order effects that might have gone with opening fire there. But he's carrying it as basically because they didn't open fire, he believes that the bombing actually occurred. I'm not able to independently verify whether or not this is the same individual that ultimately detonated, but one way or the other, that's a lot to carry.
And I think one point that's particularly powerful that I know from my experience in combat, and I think anyone else who's been there understands, is the unique gravity around the loss and wounding of kids. And you really powerfully report on, the vivid imagery. I think at one point saying that there was one girl holding like a baby and then a 4-year-old in the hand, and they kind of get lost in the crowd. The baby had to be revived. And there are these moments where children were swept up in that mix that I think is still underreported until you hear it in their words and you understand how hard it was for everyone in that melee that they describe kind of like a mosh pit from hell, right? Is there two questions that are related then? One, did you get resistance from the Department of Defense or anyone else in trying to sit down with these folks, or are they all out now? How did you negotiate that? Because it seems like they've kept a lid on this for quite a while, and it's taken time and space before the truth can come out. So how did you get to this, and did you face any resistance from the bureaucracy?
Yeah, I mean, I cast a very wide net on this, trying to reach whoever we could. We got a lot of no's. Just as one instance, I asked the 82nd Airborne, hey, do you have anybody that would be willing to talk? And the answer I got was more or less, we're not doing that. We're not doing that at this time. So the 82nd Airborne, there are no interviews in the story from them. So initially, I went down to Camp Lejeune last month. We interviewed a couple Marines there. They both appeared in the story. Sasha Savage is one. She was in charge of a female search team. The other one is Gunnery Sergeant Jonathan Eby. Really appreciated his time. That's an example of somebody who has gone through a lot, is carrying a lot. He was the platoon sergeant in charge of the platoon that was hit most directly. There are 9 members of his platoon that died that day and others that were injured. He felt I think a reluctant responsibility to speak and share basically his unit's story. He was not someone that was like happy to do it. I think he felt somewhat responsible to do it, and I really appreciated his time.
And did you request the Secretary of Defense or the President or other higher ups to respond to this story? And what was the reaction there?
I mean, there was so much out there from them previously that to kind of advance this. I mean, I think we're adding layers to a story rather than bringing up new accusations. They're aware of the story. I kind of walked a couple different individuals through it, and I think because this was sort of service members telling their own story, I think there's an acknowledgement that it's time. It's been a while. We haven't heard from many people. That there's I think an obligation for this to get out at some point.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the reaction from the White House. I mean, it's coming at this time where Biden's got a string of wins. There seem to be some good results in the congressional elections, the special elections. The White House feels like they're on a roll. And now here comes the anniversary of Afghanistan with these guys telling vivid stories about something that they don't seem to want to engage on. It still seems very much unresolved. I think Matt Zeller has been really effective in explaining that there's a lot we could have done for the Afghans. And if you want to see, just look at what we did for Ukraine. So before we get to Ukraine, I know they're not a monolith, Dan, but can you take away their overall feeling toward the president and toward the government and how they've handled this? I've called it America's great betrayal of Afghanistan. I know that I see more outrage from different parts of the community on this than almost anything else I've seen. But what did you hear from these folks, and do they blame leaders? Are they angry at leaders in particular for putting them in that situation and under-resourcing them when they did?
Candidly, a couple of these interviews were carried out with sort of an understanding that these individuals are still in uniform. We steered clear of heavily partisan questions. It was really a desire to explain what happened in a level of detail we didn't have previously.
Um, I'm going to be interested to see where that goes, right? Because as myself, I remember being able to talk about Iraq when I was in uniform, getting interviewed by 60 Minutes, and then when I came home and was able to take my uniform off and speak more freely. So I'm looking forward to these guys and gals being able to speak freely. I recommend everybody listen to the podcast, read the story. Let's talk about another piece of breaking news, Dan. Again, in the midst of all this. Biden authorizes a strike in Syria on Iranian assets, right? And my headline was, "Hey, America, we are still at war." A year ago, and on Memorial Day, the president and others said, "This is the first Memorial Day America's not at war." And then you had Tim Kaine and others piling on. And meanwhile, you're covering things like this. So, can you give us insight into what you think is most important about this, other than that it happened, right? And most Americans don't realize that we still have forces that are striking targets in places like Syria. But what do you think is the biggest takeaway from this incident?
I mean, I think in terms of the nuts and bolts of the incident, this isn't something that comes up as this is not a Afghan evacuation or a disaster in Niger or something like this. This is something that's lower level, but it's a good reminder of sort of the breadth of the missions the Defense Department still has, that there are still service members in harm's way, that even though we don't hear about it a lot, things can go wrong. People still get shot at, that sort of thing. This strike was carried out in response to an attack, a recent attack previous to that. So anyone who's in this sort of tinderbox, you're dealing with a situation where you've got Syrian forces, you've got Iranian-backed forces. That there's at least some question here how closely linked the group that they struck was connected to the IRGC, which would go directly back to Iranian government. These are things that are open questions and continue to be issues for anybody still on the ground.
Yeah, I think between this and the Zawahiri hit, there's kind of I don't think most Americans are tracking on this, but there's a feeling like this is what the future of war for America could look like. We'll reach out and touch someone with a drone or with an asset without having a heavy boot presence on the ground, right? Whether it's by proxy in Ukraine or it's by drone or UAV asset. This feels like what war could have been much earlier if we had pulled out of Afghanistan or pulled out of other places, but was happening simultaneously along the way. So you've still got Somalia and Syria and Ukraine, all these other pots of places where American forces are still activating, but there's still a feeling, I think, from the White House that they don't really want to elevate it. It's not something that they're leading, the press conferences with. They're not starting with messaging on that. And I think it's our responsibility to continue to cover it and give light to it. And I wonder, you've got your ear to the ground on Ukraine. It's the 6-month anniversary of the invasion. They've been at war 8 years, I think roughly all together. But can you give a sense, Dan, the president announced another round of support, weapons and support for Ukraine. Do you feel like the tank is running out in the Pentagon and in Washington? Do you feel like people still have the level of support for Ukraine that they did before? Or do you feel like now with inflation and extremism and other problems that Ukraine is losing support inside the building and other places?
I see no indications anything slowing down in terms of Defense Department support. If anything, I think we're starting to see signs of a shift to sort of a longer term, idea. What's support look like a year from now, 2 years from now? It's no longer sort of package to package or month to month. As we're speaking, we're watching an announcement of $3 billion of support going forward. And a lot of that is money that's designed to buy weapons. It's not weapons they necessarily have in a locker or in a hangar somewhere now, but it's things that they're planning longer term. There's a shift already. Initially it was a lot of planes landing, dropping supplies off in places like Poland. You're starting to see now a shift where you're also starting to see weapons put on sea lift and they kind of take the long route over there, but you can put a whole lot more on those ships than you can in the back of a C-17. And they're kind of mixing those two methods of delivery. And I think that goes to show this is, no longer a, today crisis so much as a, what are they going to do to kind of, extend this, stay involved, hopefully keep U.S. boots off the ground, in their own eyes and plans. But with all the unpredictability still there.
Dan, I hope you can stick around for our Patreon members for a couple of quick fire questions. I want to get into the craft of reporting. Maybe we'll talk a little more baseball for our Patreon members exclusively. But before I do that, to kind of bring this back around, you've been great about being a part of this show and helping us understand not just what's happening now, but what's happening next. I've tried to bring visibility to potential conflict in the Arctic. The Africa Command is something I don't think most Americans even know exists. Is there something on the horizon that you are covering or have covered or want to cover that you think is next that the country should be watching for?
I mean, in the 2 to 5 year term, I think the discussion of Taiwan is something that, we don't necessarily have full control as the United States of when that discussion becomes a imminent thing as opposed to a long-term, maybe 5 years out thing. That's a significant issue. What China is doing in general is a significant concern for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle at this point. That can extend into the Arctic, that can extend into the Pacific. There's already greater Chinese influence in Africa. It's pretty broad. So that would be one. The other thing is, as Russia continues down the road they're going, you kind of wonder, as they kind of spin their wheels, how unpredictable does Vladimir Putin get? He's already made decisions that, caught a lot of people flat-footed. So as this continues to progress, what else does he do? That's another significant concern. And then, you play this out over a longer span of time. Climate change is an issue that I think is a punchline for some people. For others, it's a very serious concern. But you look down the road, 5, 10, 30 years down the road. How does that change our world? What do ports look like? How is that different? What does drought look like? How is that different? These are all things that will matter long term.
I think that's a fantastic overview and preview of what could be to come. The one issue we didn't touch on, Dan, that I wanted to get your thoughts on, you joined us back in January 2021, right after the insurrection, and February 22nd, February 22, you came back again. Can you give us a sense of how much of the Pentagon's time is focused on domestic extremism and domestic threats? They've called it at times the number one threat facing our country. We see how divisive and devastating it can be. Can you paint a picture for us, like how much of, the SecDef has his brain divided into pieces around Taiwan, Ukraine, all these other pieces? Is there a way to assess an increase in focus or resources on the threat of domestic extremism specifically?
I would argue it's has greater attention than it used to, but it is still not in that same category. And then I guess in some ways, when you look at the scope of something like Ukraine, you can kind of understand how much brain power that takes. But when we see these cases pop up, we often see them in like Justice Department press releases, where it's like, oh yeah, this one random dude, had these terrible plans and they caught him. But you're always wondering, which one do they not catch? At some point, you worry that some of this gets through, and it's often handled seemingly on a case-by-case basis rather than a systemic situation. So they're going to have to sort through what they want to do with that. How do you handle that, and how do you handle that in a way that's fair? And I don't see it as one where there's a lot of easy answers.
Yeah, I really appreciate that insight. I mean, there's also this question of whether the military is becoming too woke, right? It's become a punching bag for Fox News and Tucker Carlson and others at a time when they're trying to wrestle with cleaning up domestic extremism, even within their own ranks. There's a process underway to rename military bases. It feels like some of that has kind of been put on pause, but maybe the presidential election will reignite it. But I always appreciate your insight, man. I think you're a tremendously important leader for this country. You're providing a tremendous public service. I hope they give you lots of Pulitzers and your own show. But until then, thank you for being out there and for doing some incredible reporting. I think you represent the best of what American journalism is all about. And I hope you can join us again soon, man.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Go Yanks.